everyone. I'm Scott Peters, and welcome to my office here in beautiful Whitewater, Wisconsin. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the work that I do in gifted education and how I got started in it. So if you see me looking off camera, it's because I'm looking over here at the questions that I'm supposed to answer. And so hopefully these will provide helpful to you in some way. And if nothing else, I'll try to be entertaining in some way. So I'm Scott Peters. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I'm also currently the association editor for the National Association for Gifted Children. Major work that I've done, I have a couple different books. I suppose the major books that I've done are Beyond Gifted Education, which kind of talked about reconceptualizing the idea of gifted ed very much through a response to intervention framework. The other book, I guess, that I've done is with Jonathan Plucker was about excellence gaps. So he and I wrote a book with Harvard Education Press about excellence gaps. And then the third book was with Dina Bruhlsen about creating gifted education plans. But mostly my work is not in books. Mostly it's in scholarly articles, empirical research, and publications, all of which I try to make freely available on my website. So if you want to read any of that, you don't have to pay for it. You don't have to have a subscription to the journal. Go to go.uww.edu/PetersS, P-E-T-E-R-S-S. And all of my publications, I post preprints there so that they are universally available. So go wild if that's your thing. Why did I go into this field? I went into this field because I like the idea of matching what students learn with what they already know. The whole idea of zone of proximal development, that we should be teaching students so that they learn new things, challenging them in their ZPD, and advanced learners seem like those who were most ill-suited. Most improperly challenged. And so that's why it got really interesting to me. And I finished my PhD 11 years ago, so this is my 11th year as an academic in the field. What are the most important unanswered questions? I think there's actually a lot of really important unanswered questions. For example, what's the purpose of gifted education? Why do we have gifted services? And what goals are they supposed to accomplish? That's actually not an unanswered question. It's more a question that we don't even answer, or we don't even ask very often. So what unmet need do students have that cause us in this building to have this service? I don't think we've actually fleshed that out well enough. And then when school board members or someone come to us, we don't have a good answer for that, and that's not good. So we need to be able to say, we have this service because we've identified this need as not being met in our school, and without this service, that kid would go under challenge. Like, we need to have really specific rationale for our services. And that's a question we don't answer very much. Which gets to a different question that's not been answered, which is, what identification systems are good for identifying unmet needs? How do we appropriately find the people that need the services that we have to provide? Again, not something we ask very often. We talk a lot about what makes for good or bad identification, but identification for what? That's the thing that we aren't really talking about. I think we're very much moving from kind of the old model of gifted ed, the gifted child kind of paradigm, into a newer model where gifted ed is much more need for a domain-specific service. And it's much less about a trait that certain humans have. And because of that, identification and services are really kind of changing. The obstacles to that, well, it makes for your student population much less well-defined. Who needs the particular service at any given time is not necessarily clear under a different model. Under the model where, who's under challenged right now? I don't know, it's going to vary from year to year. It's going to vary from school to school. That makes it a lot less easy to advocate. So it's hard to say, oh, we need to have this service because there are these gifted kids. Instead, we have these services for the kids who are under challenge. It totally reframes the conversation, and so it becomes really hard to talk about. And then just the phrase gifted. In the future, the phrase gifted is just going to have to go. I mean, the concept of giftedness is a barrier to our own stated goals. In my experiences so far. I mean, if instead of saying we need this service because of the gifted kids need it, if instead we were saying we need this math service because there's some kids that are just ready for more math, that's such an easier thing to sell. But for some reason, we're really married to this concept. And I'm not saying these kids don't exist. I'm just saying that using that concept is actually preventing us from making progress in that area. Best practices for identification. Well, first of all, alignment. So identify this within the same domain as you are going to serve. So if your services are going to be primarily language arts based, don't identify in math. Or if you're going to identify with math, provide a math service. There needs to be alignment between what you're measuring, the content and the skills measured by your identification system, and what is happening in the service. If those don't align, there's no point. Like, there's nothing else you can fix about identification if there's not that alignment. The other thing I'd say is use local norms for local services. If you're talking about identifying kids for advanced services within your school building, you should be identifying the most advanced kids in your school building. National norms don't do that. National norms will give you very consistent and homogeneous populations. So if you set the national norm at the 90th percentile, everyone you identify will be at the 90th percentile, but they're also going to identify the most non-representative population of gifted kids. So if you use local norms, it makes more sense for local gifted services, and it also gives you much more diverse students. Again, on that website, there's an article that we posted about this. You see big increases in diversity of representation under building norms. The other thing I'd say for best practice and identification is to just lower the cut scores. We in the field of gifted ed really need to knock it off with the 99th percentile cut scores. Not only are a lot of our tests just not as accurate at that level, but we also just don't have a lot of evidence that you have to be at the 99.9th percentile to benefit from most gifted services. So we end up just looking needlessly exclusionary. And so I think we really need to kind of step back and ask ourselves if our typical identification methods really are necessary for the program. Are they keeping kids out who would otherwise fail or not benefit from the program? And are they correctly catching kids that would benefit? That's really how we should be operationalizing goodness in gifted education. Or for identification. Goodness should be, is the system catching all the kids who would benefit from the service? And that's not something we look at very often. Why has equity been so hard in gifted ed? Because society is inequitable. I mean, there's no identification system that you can implement that's not going to show some level of inequity because it's measuring the underlying inequity and opportunity and learning in the country. Low-income kids have fewer educational options than high-income kids in the country. White kids have more educational options than African-American kids in this country. That's going to pan out in test scores, in gifted education placement. Racism has negative effects on kids, and that negative effect is going to play out on test scores. It's going to play out in learning in the classroom. We are going to see some disproportionality, even with a completely unbiased system. It's not good, nobody wants to talk about it, but we would really have to make large-scale societal change if we wanted to completely eliminate disproportionality in gifted ed. Same with higher ed. Excuse me. If we wanted to eliminate disproportionality in college enrollment, we'd really have to eliminate larger societal inequality. We can address some of that by fixing really terrible identification practices, like the need for a teacher referral to be obtained by a student before any other identification systems go in place. That's a major barrier, and it exacerbates disproportionality. So universal consideration or universal screening make that a lot better, but they're never going to completely eliminate it because of the larger societal inequality. Not all of disproportionality is due to a bad identification practice. Some of it is due to actual differences due to societal inequality, unfortunately. That's a much harder thing to fix. Biggest misconceptions. This could be an entire 4-hour conversation. So biggest misconceptions about administrators responsible for gifted ed have about their field or their students. Gifted students are not a homogeneous population. I mean, even if we say gifted is a 130 IQ or higher, they're still not homogeneous. That's still a very diverse group of students, and that's a very narrow view of giftedness. The other thing I'd say is that, although people might disagree with me, giftedness is not a trait of certain people that mean, your soul is different. In many cases, it just means you're under-challenged in your current educational placement. That's very much how I view gifted ed, is do you need something that you're not currently getting? That's the question that I care about from the standpoint of schools. Many people approach gifted ed as these students having these really unique social emotional challenges, and many gifted students do suffer from depression, mental health, perfectionism, whatever. But we don't see that at scale. We don't see that as a systematic problem across all identified gifted students. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's not a consistent characteristic of gifted kids, and yet we often present them as having these really unique social and emotional needs. And I just think that doesn't pan out in science. I think we have a lot of misconceptions about things in gifted ed that just aren't supported by science, like the idea that achievement tests measure something different than ability tests, the idea that bright kids are different than gifted kids. I think these are a lot of very common beliefs that just aren't, and they might be true, they very well might be true, but they aren't currently supported by science. So we do have a lot of misconceptions in the field. If I could change one thing about gifted learner, how gifted learners are educated, what would that be? I wouldn't call them gifted. I would just have a range of services across a range of content areas, and I would place you in that service if the data says you're ready for it. And I would stop referring to things as gifted. Again, I think we can meet the goals that we set for ourselves, that we have for most of our services, without using the term gifted, and I think the term gifted literally holds us back. Just the other day, the school chancellor for New York City schools mentioned that everyone is gifted. He literally said that he believes that every kid is gifted and talented, and it's just that we need to accept that. That's the thing that's holding us back. He would never say that. He would never say that every single kid needs calculus right now. But he's comfortable saying every kid is gifted. That's a problem with the term. I'm not saying getting rid of the term would solve everything, but the term is a barrier, and I'll go to my grave saying that. I would also really walk back the idea of age-based grades. I think we need to be much more flexible with age-based grade levels. The idea that you're 7, so you learn this in school is just dumb. It doesn't make any sense. We need to make it more flexible so that 7-year-olds can sometimes access content typical for 10-year-olds, or can sometimes access the remediation that is common content for 5-year-olds. We need to have a more flexible system. I mean, that's really what personalized learning is all about. We're still in our infancy with that. It's not a perfect system, but I think that's very much where we're headed. And I think that's where gifted ed is probably going to go. It's going to go much more towards domain-specific talent development in certain areas. It's going to be much more flexible from year to year, who is served now versus later. They're going to have much more concrete learning objectives and concrete outcomes with concrete identification systems. We're going to move away from identifying kids as these globally gifted learners, and instead we're going to move towards identifying kids for specific interventions in this building right now. That's very much how I see us moving from traditional gifted ed to much more contemporary gifted ed. Moving from global diagnosis of this subpopulation known as the gifted, and towards searching out kids who need additional challenge in this content area in my school on Tuesday. So much more local and in the present tense. So I think I've answered a whole bunch of questions. I know I've talked for a long time. I hope people are welcome to always email me with questions or for copies of any of my work if that would be helpful or if they want to read it. Obviously it doesn't help kids if it's not out there. So email me anytime, peterss@uww.edu, and I hope this was helpful.